Welcome to today's discussion on comparing federations with reference to India. So long, I hope you have been learning extensively on different aspects and parameters of Indian federation or the federalism in India as it is obtained. Its constitutional principles, its structural aspects, institutions, and practices. But focusing solely on India creates some kind of a problem in the sense that then we can be totally parochial in our outlook and we may fail to discern or find out our actual areas of success or failure, the strength and weaknesses of Indian federalism. For that, we need a comparative approach, and it's practical also because India is not the only federation in the world. There are in fact about 24 to 27 federal systems spread across the world, including 7 of the world's 8 largest countries, barring of course China, which is not a federal system but rather a unitary system. And it has within itself about 40% of world's population. In fact, long before federalism was established in India via our 1950 constitution, the modern federalism first appeared, we may say, in USA through its 1789 constitutional principles, or the constitution itself. In that sense, USA is the pioneer of modern federal structure. And since then, throughout 19th century and 20th century, we have seen the spread of the federal idea across the world, and we have also found out after the end of the Second World War, many new states like India and Pakistan, they also opted for a federal structure. So, to proceed further, I think at this stage one needs to define what is meant by federation, and I will just focus on one particular definition provided to us by the leading experts on federalism, Ron Watts of Canada. I quote, Watts says, as a form of government, quote, a federation is a compound polity combining constituent units and a general government, each possessing powers delegated to it with the people through a constitution, each empowered to deal directly with the citizens in the exercise of its significant portion of its legislative, administrative, and taxing powers, and each elected directly by its citizens. So the focus is on a compound polity. The focus is on each having its own responsibility and powers, and the focus is also on each being elected or selected or nominated, whatever be it, by its own people, which means no one of the levels is dependent on the other for its existence. Now, from that kind of definition, which is more descriptive rather than prescriptive, we can easily find out certain common features of federalism which can be found in all 20 odd federations spread across the world. Now, it is like this, that the first principle, first common characteristic is that it is a multi-level governance. So there has to be at least 2 levels of governance, the central or the national or the federal level at the top, and at the bottom the regional, local or the state level. And by using the word top at the bottom, I am not being very subjective about it, just merely describing it. That's the first characteristic. The second characteristic is that since there are 2 levels of government, there has to be kind of a division of power so that unnecessary conflict of interest doesn't break out between the two. And to make it foolproof and to make it appear less arbitrary or less ad hoc, the division must be done constitutionally. And if we look at India's constitution, we find the 7th schedule of the Constitution of India does that exactly by providing 3 separate lists of power: the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. And thirdly, whenever there is, and there will be, practically, there will be conflicts of jurisdiction, conflicts over encroachment into one's own power areas, either by the national government protesting against the states overusing its own powers, or the state governments, which is fairly frequent. They accuse the central government of encroaching in its own power area. So there has to be some kind of a neutral arbiter which will look into such conflicts and allegations and whatever be it. And so every federal system for that purpose has some kind of a apex court, apex judicial system. Is known by various names. In India, we call it the Supreme Court of India. In USA, we call it the Supreme Court of the United States. In Russian Federation, it is called the Constitutional Court, and a court which is essentially endowed with the power of dealing with conflicts regarding jurisdiction between the national level and the regional local level, and also between and among the regional governments. So these are the 3 basic essential requirements of a federal system, the first being 2 levels, third being a constitutional division of power, and second being that, and third being the presence of a constitutional court or a federal court to look into the allegations of encroachment into power areas. And also there should be a system of a shared rule in the sense that there, as you have to remember, that the basic principle of federalism being shared rule and self-rule. So long we have been focusing on self-rule, the shared rule, which means both the national government and the state governments work together for policy making for the entire nation, that must also be there. So for that reason, we find in India, example, the presence of 2 chambers of our parliament, the first chamber and the second chamber, which is called the Rajya Sabha, or the House of the States, which basically is composed of representatives drawn from different states as states themselves. And the lawmaking process needs both the houses of parliament, and also it needs the president. So that's how the principle of shared rule is operationalized in Indian parliament. And the same can be found in almost every, or should I say almost in every federation. It's basically a bicameral system of parliament. In USA, we find the House of Representatives as the lower chamber and the Senate as the upper chamber. The same is with Russia, with Switzerland, with Germany. Everywhere, wherever you find a federal system, we will find a bicameral system of parliament, which assures that the principle of shared rule is operationalized. With these basic words, introductions, we have already mentioned that there are about 24 to 27 federations spread across the world, containing 7 of the world's 8 largest, population-wise 8 largest countries, without, of course, China, which is a unitary system, and accommodating within this world of federal states about 40% of the total population of the world. With these introductory words, we'll go straight into the aspect of comparison. The first thing that we should keep in mind, and always, as was Ron Wirtz says, that there is no single pure model of federation that is applicable everywhere. Which means that while you compare 2 federations, while you compare 2 or more federations, there is no single benchmark against which to compare. No single ideal, typical model of federation which can be our standard of comparison. Every federal system is unique. It's unique because a federal system grows up or rises or is created in a particular socio-political and economic or historical environment which together shape the nature and structure of the federation obtained in that particular country. So, as there is no single model, we also cannot constitute a hierarchy of arranged according to the best federation and up down below to the worst federation. So, there is no hierarchy, there is no single model. We have to keep these two things in mind, and with that kind of an open mind, we can compare federations across the world. Now, what kind of variations we find? If you look across all the federations in the world, we see them different and also similar. Similar mainly institutionally. We find certain federal institutions present in every federal system, as we have talked about: a bicameral parliament, a constitution which divides power, and also a constitutional court, and the two levels of government, of course. As we're talking about two levels, we have to mention one exception at least, that Brazil, one of the leading federations in the world, has in fact three levels. It has incorporated the municipal level into the federal structure of things. So it's basically two levels, multi-level. When you say multi-level, it's two-level governance. The variations which you find spread across the world is, to start with, the historical situation in which the federation was born in a particular country. The number of constituent units. In Indian case, there are 28 states and 6 union territories. In the US case, there are 50 states. In the case of the Russian Federation, it is about 85 to 86 units apart from the national government. So it varies from states to states how many units will be there, the constituent units or the federative units, as you may call them. And on this point, we will take a bit of a diversion, that asking the question, does this number of unit or constituent units remain the same throughout history, or there can be a change? The number of units may be decrease or increase. We start with the first federation, the United States. They can and they have added to. They started with 13 units in 1789, and now there are 50 constitutive states in the US Federation, in the USA. But in the US Constitution specifically prohibits the changing of the boundaries of these 50 states so as to create new states, something which you don't find in India. In India, if you may remember that in 1950, when we started our journey as a republican system, with the new constitution being put into force, we started with 16 states, and now there are 28 states. If we just set aside the case of Sikkim, which was not there at the time of our independence or our 1950 constitution being put to force, which is not within the Indian territory, apart from Sikkim, and which ultimately in the mid-1970s came into the Indian Federation. Apart from that, all these numbers, let's say that makes from 16 to 27, they have been created from the same territory by altering, cutting away, joining, merging different state boundaries. And that's how Jharkhand came out of Bihar. That's how Chhattisgarh was created out of Madhya Pradesh. So that's a history is there. And the last one was Telangana. And this is prohibited in United States and in many other systems as well. But in Russian Federation, there have been mergers of different units, creating a larger unit. So It is not sacrosanct that the number of constituent units have to be kept constant. It depends on the historical manner in which that particular federation was created. In the US case, if you may remember, if you go back to the 70s of the 18th century, after 1776 War of Independence, when they won, there are 13 independent colonies, and who first came together to form some kind of a halfway house we call confederation. And there's a long debate from 1776, from 1777 to 1789 of which kind of system to be adopt, a confederation, which means a loose federation, or a federal system. So ultimately they opted on the federal system on the premise or on the solid foundation that these 13 states, each state is not going to lose its own identity. And talking about identity, if we look at the American units of the American Federation, the 50 states, each state has its own constitution and even its own flag, something which is not there in most of the federations, including India. Though as an exception, it is not there now. As an exception, by virtue of the now abrogated Article 370 of the Constitution, Jammu and Kashmir had its own constitution, not its own flag. Though in every federation, the division is never arbitrary, as mentioned, finds a place of mention in the Constitution itself, but there are differences as well. Important point is note that in the Indian Constitution, if you look at 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, we find 3 lists. The list of powers meant exclusively for the central government, the union list, meant exclusively for the state government, the state list, and for both the sets of government in which each can work also, there are concurrent lists. And with the proviso, in the concurrent list, which is joint list, if a law made by the central government or the national government comes into conflict with the law made by the state government, then the national government law will prevail. But there is another concept which is very important, is that it's called the residuary power concept. That when the Constitution is being written, as it was done, we all know, between 1946 and 1949, it is not always possible to think about any kind of future contingency which may arise. So not always possible to list exclusively and finally all the powers given to the union government or the state government or on the concurrent list. New problems arise, new situations arise, new contingencies arise. So at each level, either the national government or the state government will have to work, and whenever it has to work, it needs power, it needs authority. So the list of powers can always increase. So these are called residuary powers, powers about which nothing could be foreseen or thought before while the Constitution was being drafted. And in fact, that's very important, because our Constitution came into existence in 1950, and today it is 2022. There have been warfares, national calamities, economic crisis, political crisis. So nothing of which could be foreseen in 1950 or 1949 or 1948. So, and all of them now add to the list of powers, and who enjoys these residuary powers. That's very important. In the Indian Constitution, the residuary powers have been clearly given to the national government or the union government, which means it is always an advantage, because new problems will always crop up, in which have to be taken care of. But if you look at some other states, in USA, start with USA for example, in USA we find 3 lists, also 3 lists you can find in USA. The first list clearly specifies which it is Article 1, Section 8. It clearly specifies the powers given to the federal government by which the national government in the US is known. Section 9 specifically denies to the union government certain powers. Denies. Section 10 of the same Article 1 denies powers to the state government, which means denial means areas in which the state government cannot make laws, cannot encroach. The previous one for areas in which the federal government cannot encroach. All other powers, either given or denied by the Section 8 or Section 9 or 10, are given over to the state governments, which means by the concept of residuary powers, the states in USA, they enjoy all the residuary powers. But in Russian Federation, there are two lists also. One is list for the national government. One is a list which we call in Indian vocabulary concurrent list, in which the national government and the unit governments are responsible, and powers not mentioned in either of these two lists belong essentially to the units of federation, which they call federative units. So we find that the residuary power concept is very important, because in a system where it is given exclusively to the central government, it creates a situation in which the power, the quantum of power in hands of the central government, legislative power, lawmaking power, goes on increasing, because newer and newer problems keep on appearing on this horizon, and those problems have to be solved. That's an important kind of a difference, and that's why we often raise the doubt whether the federal system in India is some kind of a pure federal system, or is some kind of, as the earliest experts on federation, Casey Ware, used to call India to be a kind of a quasi-federation, or India is a federation with a strong centralized features. Secondly, how the states find their representation nationally, which means how they can, or can they, and they should, how they can play their role in the national policy making. We have been talking about the presence of a bicameral parliament at the national level, which we find in every federal system. But the difference is how that second chamber, the chamber, the house, whatever you call it, of the parliament, in which the states find their representation is constituted. And that also is an indicator of the power given to that second chamber, or the which we call the upper house, or the second chamber, or in Indian case the Rajya Sabha, whatever be it. In USA it is Senate. In India, as we know and have been told before, that states send their representatives as per their population, which is some kind of weighted representation, to the Rajya Sabha, and they are not popularly elected, they are indirectly elected. In USA, the second chamber is known as the Senate, composed of equal number of members from each state, which is 50 into 2, there is 100 members, a fixed number, and these senators, the members of the Senate, are directly elected by the people themselves. In Brazil, they are directly elected. Whenever a chamber is directly elected by the people, if you look at the Indian case, the first chamber, the lower house, the Lok Sabha, is directly elected by the people. We vote for them. The upper house, we the ordinary citizens, the common citizens, we don't vote for them. So it's some kind of a indirectly elected body. I would say in the standard of legitimacy, popular legitimacy, any directly elected body carries more legitimacy than the body which is not directly elected or indirectly elected. In that sense, the second chamber in India is, as far as popular legitimacy is concerned, is somewhat less than the Senate in USA or the second chamber in Brazil. And that is also obvious that if we look at the way our Indian Parliament functions, the second chamber, the Rajya Sabha, usually plays some kind of a second fiddle to the Lok Sabha, or the House of the People, and it has a somewhat limited or circumscribed area of power as compared to the Lok Sabha. On the other hand, the Senate, the second chamber, the chamber of the US constituted US states, 50 states, is actually more powerful in many areas, is more powerful, particularly in the areas of foreign affairs, is more powerful than the US lower house or the US House of Representatives. So that's some kind of a comparison. So now, if we now come to the election of governors, now since there are states, the constituent states are there, whatever be the number, 30 or 40 or 50 or 28, each state must have a formal executive head in which the usually known as governors. Now, in India, the governors of Indian states are not elected by the people of that particular state. They are appointed by the president on the recommendation of the prime minister and the cabinet of ministers. State governments previously had no role to play in selection of the governor, but later on, after much changes and amendments and all that, the state governments, the opinion of the state governments are now being sought before a particular governor is appointed. But in USA, the state governors are directly elected. In Brazil, they're directly elected. In Mexico, they're directly elected. And any functionary who is publicly and directly elected, popularly elected, any functionary is bound to carry much more weight, much more importance, significance, and legitimacy than one who is nominated or appointed by some other authority. And in fact, since 1960s or since the middle of the 1960s, the office of the governor has been one of the most serious bone of contention between the central government and the state government, and it is always so. If you just look at the happenings in West Bengal or in Kerala recently, that always is a problem regarding the governor. The state government doesn't like him or her. The central government, and since there is a political party system in place, the appointments are always political. So that's a problem here. So the problem could be avoided if we have opted for a direct election of the governor in India as compared to what we have found in what we find in other political systems like Brazil or USA. So we have more or less seen the major differences between the political systems. In fact, we cannot in the course of a lecture, in single lecture, we cannot compare federations on all particular parameters, but we have tried to focus on the important ones in the sense that the basic principle of shared rule and self-rule carries the premise that the states or the constituent units of federation are very important. We have studied at the very beginning that each federation is unique, but still comparisons are necessary because we may find some way out of some of the impasse we may face in the working of our federal structure by looking at what is being practiced in other federations with an open mind, not with a superiority complex or with an inferiority complex. With an open mind, if we find out practices in other federations, compare them with our own, we may strengthen our own federation. We may remove to a certain extent our points of weakness and giving India a better federal system as compared to the present one. So that is basically the reason why we go in for the comparison, knowing very well that each federation is unique and cannot be compared. In fact, in a way, we are trying to compare the incomparables in the hope that out of that exercise some additional knowledge may emerge, some new insight may emerge also. Thank you.